Now let's talk about sniffing in terms of a switched versus a non-switched environment. Now, actually, sniffing and capturing traffic is quite simple in an environment or a network that doesn't have any switches involved. And basically the reason for this is, if you go back to your basic networking theory, all the traffic is visible if it goes through a hub or is on the same wire or the same local network. Okay, everything that is sent down the wire can be seen by every other computer. Broadcasts, unicasts, collisions, anything. All that can be seen by every other computer. However, normally, in a normal environment, computers will see all the traffic along the wire, but they will only respond to the traffic that's destined for them. In other words, they will ignore all the other traffic. Now, a sniffer, on the other hand, it sees all the traffic along the wire, of course, but it also records it and captures it. Now, in a switched network, this is a little bit different. You have to go back again to basic network theory and realize why we have switches on the network. Switches are essentially designed to limit traffic because they want to limit congestion on the wire, congestion in the network, so they limit what's known as collision domains. And a collision domain is basically a single area of the network where all the traffic flows to back and forth between all hosts. In a switched environment, the collision domain is essentially between the switch itself, the switch port that the computer is connected to, and the computer. So there's only two boxes in that collision domain. As a result, switches make it so that a host only sees traffic that's sent between it and the switch. Any other traffic to and from other computers through the switch is ignored. It's not forwarded through the switch to the computer. So that computer will see broadcast traffic, it will see traffic from other computers directed to it through the switch, but not conversations between other computers. Now, as I said, broadcasts are still forwarded. The only way to limit broadcast domain, other than routers, are VLANs, and that can be done on a switch too, so that makes it a little bit more difficult to sniff if you have VLANs involved. But normally in a typical switched environment where VLANs are not involved or not configured, broadcasts are still forwarded. A sniffer placed on the switch will see only traffic to and from itself in the switch, and it'll see broadcast traffic. It won't see other traffic between other computers, as I said before. So switches can basically impede sniffing greatly, and as a security measure, security specialists will tell you to replace your hubs with switches for this reason, because it makes it very difficult to sniff. Now, previously a lot of people would tell you it's impossible to sniff in a switched network. Well, that's not true, actually. It can be done. It is a little bit more difficult to do, but it can be done. Now, let's say that you're the legitimate administrator of a network and you'd like to sniff the traffic on your network for troubleshooting or security reasons, but you've got a switched network. How do you legally get around that? Well, you can do what's known as port spanning. You can configure a port on the switch to mirror traffic from other ports to it. So it essentially can see the traffic on the other ports as the other computers see it. So it can sniff those ports as well. Now that's kind of, like I said, the legal way of doing it if you're the administrator. If you're not the administrator, well, there's a couple of ways to do it if you're doing a penetration test, and hackers actually use these methods too. The first method would be ARP spoofing. What would happen is you would spoof your computer's address with the address of another host, such as the router. You would essentially say, I'm the router and here is the MAC address for the router, and you would spoof that address. Well, all the other computers, because you're the default gateway or router, might send traffic to you, even traffic that's not normally destined for you. Now, in order to prevent yourself from being caught, what you'd have to do is, on your sniffer, on your box that's doing that, you'd still have to forward that traffic onto the legitimate router. So you'd have to have IP routing enabled, and you'd have to have a manual entry in your ARP cache that tells what the true relationship between the IP and MAC address is for the actual router. So you could do this and not get detected if you're spoofing. It probably wouldn't last very long because there are ways around this. There are intrusion detection systems that can detect this sort of thing going on. Now, the other method is ARP flooding. And what you're doing with ARP flooding, you're essentially flooding the switch. You're attacking the switch itself. And what you're doing is you're actually turning the switch into a glorified hub. Because what happens is switches store MAC address in tables, and they can hold a few thousand at a time. But if you flood the switch with MAC addresses, with ARP broadcasts, as a matter of fact, you will eventually overcome those tables, do an overflow, and that switch has no choice but it can't keep up with all the traffic that's coming through it, and it can't remember all those MAC addresses. So it essentially starts flooding the traffic out each port. Okay? and that's known as ARP flooding. You've essentially turned your switch that limits traffic into a simple hub that forwards traffic out every port, making it easy to sniff. Now again, this probably is not going to work for very long because a lot of newer switches are built intelligently to prevent this kind of attack or to at least detect it. And again, intrusion detection systems can detect this stuff. It can detect, massive amounts of ARP flooding and things like that. So this won't last very long. So if you're able to do this, you're probably only going to be able to do it for a couple of minutes and sniff some traffic that may be important to you, and then the IDS is going to alert the administrator, or the switch is going to come into play and stop it. So those are ways around sniffing switch traffic. So it's not impossible to do it, but it probably won't last too long if you do it. And those are just some considerations that you should know when you're sniffing or capturing traffic in a switched environment versus a non-switched environment.